Welcome, happy Earth Day. This is Sam Ehrman. I use he, him pronouns. I am joined by
Andrew. I also use he, him pronouns.
and we're going to talk today about trees and climate change, or Andrew will. We have a really exciting talk for you. Andrew is a wealth of knowledge, and we're going to be focusing on trees that will bring us through a changing climate. And that will survive, and we're going to focus on Ginkgo biloba, which you can see behind us. We're in the Irving Park tennis courts, and there's this amazing heritage Ginkgo biloba that we'll be focused on today, but that's kind of why we're in a fenced-in area. So again, thank you so much for joining. We're so excited to be celebrating with you all day on Earth Day, and Earth Month for that matter, but we have a full day of live content, and yeah, we're so thrilled. Following this, our Eugene director, Eric Burke, will be walking around Eugene, talking about trees and community in Eugene. But without any further ado, we'll get started on this talk. So thank you so much for joining. Again, happy Earth Day. If you want to support Friends of Trees this Earth Day, we do have a Earth Day match, and we are $9,000 away from hitting that $25,000 match. So if interested, there's a link in the post. Feel free to follow, and we just appreciate your support. But I'm going to turn this over to Andrew, and we're going to talk about trees for climate change.
Hello everybody, again I'm Andrew and happy Earth Day. We chose a ginkgo as our backdrop today just because at Friends of Trees we've been doing a lot of talk about planting trees for climate change. In fact, Eric, who's going to follow up, really deserves a lot of the credit for that. He's been in our ear from the Eugene office for quite a while with that terminology, using the expression trees for climate change. And what that really means is, all trees have their fantastic qualities. Some trees are just much more durable than others. And what we really want to be doing is encouraging folks to think long and hard about the tree that they're choosing, matching the tree to the site, and ultimately keeping climate change in mind. In other words, choosing the most durable option that's going to do the best, do the most good for the most people for the longest amount of time. A ginkgo is an excellent example of a tree for climate change. They have a really fascinating story, and in fact, it's kind of the symbiotic relationship between humans and ginkgos that I wanted to highlight a little bit today. Ginkgos almost went extinct I believe it was about 2.5 million years ago. They were becoming isolated due to glaciation, and they were isolated to a small pocket, I believe it was in central China. What I understood was also that they might have gone extinct had it not been for them being perceived as kind of sacred by Buddhist monks in the area who cultivated them. So they maintained as a result of that relationship with humans. And in fact, a while later, they again, because of humans, moved from China into Japan. I think this was between maybe 13 and 1400, if my memory is correct about that. Fast forward to much more modern times, about 100 years ago, there was a huge earthquake in Japan. And I think it was in 1923. And it was 7.9 on the Richter scale, and it resulted in devastating fires. A lot of the carpentry at the time was done with wood, and there was a lot of wood and glass, so the city just went up in flames. And they said that one of the few things that survived relatively unscathed were the ginkgo trees. Yes, they did look charred on the outside, and many of them died back to the ground, but they quickly resprouted. And that was really interesting context, because it was only about 20 years later that we had the very unfortunate historic episode of the Hiroshima bombing. And again, we saw that the ginkgo trees were among the very few living things that could actually survive that level of radiation. So, this relationship between trees and those people who protect them is really critical in the conversation around trees and climate change. On a more local note, it's interesting to note that in Western Oregon, I believe it was far earlier than that, 16 million years ago, there are fossils of a subtropical forest that involved ginkgos also. Apparently, those ginkgos struggled with the carbon levels in the atmosphere. And that was because at that point, there were volcanoes that were emitting huge amounts of carbon into the atmosphere, and actually made those trees disappear. But again, it's interesting to notice that they're relatively local in terms of having been endemic to Oregon at that time. That was not something that humans could control. But again, we are at a point where human activity is contributing to climate change, and also human activity in the form of protecting trees, and even selecting the trees that we plant can have a huge impact going forward. So one thing to highlight, I'll pause there for a second and talk about. We at Friends of Trees are still offering a huge spectrum of options. We have a really wide menu, so to speak, of trees, and we want folks to be happy with the tree that they choose. What we're generally trying to encourage people to consider is choosing those trees that are the most durable, and that's certainly because we want them to be thriving in 30 to 50 years. The predictions at this point are that in Portland, the weather in 30 to 50 years will be closer to that of an area 500 miles south, so roughly like the Medford to Sacramento area. So we're kind of looking south already to say, okay, well, what's thriving? We want that to be strong and healthy when we need it most, in 50 years. And in general, trees kind of fall along a spectrum, which is to say there are those trees like a ginkgo or like an Oregon white oak that grow very, very slowly, but that's because they're putting the bulk of their energy into self-defense, into immunity. So they have very few pests, very few diseases. They're really, really durable once they are established. The other end of the spectrum is something, for example, like a crabapple. And crab apples have their place. Many people love them because of their spring flowers. But they do get more pests, and they are considered shorter lived. In fact, a crabapple planted today might not be around in 50 years as a street tree. And again, that might just be because they are a little bit more at risk of pests and diseases. So actually, on the note of those trees that are most durable, in addition to the ginkgo, I also mentioned the Oregon white oak. The Oregon white oak is really historically and ecologically an incredibly significant tree locally. They also, like the ginkgo, grow very, very slowly. Once established, though, are very drought tolerant. They can handle flooding. They have no real pests or diseases. They're a really, really rock solid option. In fact, something to mention is there is an entomologist from the University of Delaware named Doug Ptolemy. And Doug Ptolemy just came out with a book called, I believe it's called The Nature of Oaks. And he makes a really compelling argument saying that the genus Quercus, which is oak, he said that is the most important genus to plant in North America, period. And the argument that he makes is that they are the backbone of food chains throughout the continent. I saw him years back at the Oregon Community Trees Conference at the World Forestry Center, and he made an incredible connection in my mind between the local food chain and those trees. The example he used was, he said, in my community in Delaware, there is a native oak that he said hosts something like 450 native insects. He said the second greatest host of native insects only hosted something like 150. I mean, it wasn't even close. It was exponentially more important to be planting that native oak. And that is something that he is saying at this point is common, definitely I've seen written in North America, if not further afield. But anyway, if you think of it, if you have an Oregon white oak that's feeding the native insects, that are feeding the native birds, that are feeding the small mammals, that are feeding the large mammals, they are really the backbone of our local food chain. And it's just added, it's just gravy that they are also super durable trees that not only endure time, they get exponentially, they provide exponentially more benefits to the people around them as they get older. They are also very, very historically significant in the Willamette Valley area. For, I believe it was 8 to 10,000 years, the native populations protected them and cultivated them. And what they would do, they would burn the white oak savannas that were characteristic of the area for millennia. And in doing so, they would protect the acorns that were a significant part of their diet. They also kept the Douglas firs that were competitive and would shade them out at bay. And ultimately, I believe it was about 150 years ago when that practice stopped. It was when the Douglas firs were finally given the advantage. They rocketed upward and shaded out the Oregon white oaks. But the white oaks are very, very characteristic. In my mind and heart, it's ironic that they are not the state tree of Oregon. But anyway, they're also a wonderful option. Both oaks and ginkgos are a wonderful option because, again, as we're looking internally at Friends of Trees, at Trees for Climate Change, we're also looking, we are saying, listen, everything is telling us that storms are going to become less predictable and more dramatic and more extreme. Just recently we had snow and ice in Portland that resulted in a lot of tree damage. And we have a pruning program that the goal of which is to prune trees for structure and for clearance. So we want to be able to prune these trees knowing that the storms are going to get more extreme. So, we don't want people to be afraid of trees. We want them to understand that trees are not a liability. Trees are an asset to have in our communities. The reason for that is that they shade things out. They shade hot spots. And I saw a webinar yesterday, and the man was saying that the #1 natural cause of death in the United States is not hurricanes or anything like that, it's heat extremes. So we know that there's a very, very significant place for creating shade and cooling temperatures, especially as we know they're predicted to get more extreme. But what we really want is to be pruning trees so that they can survive these storms, so that they are not something that people fear, because proper pruning results in far less failure, so anyway, yeah, with regard to the Trees for Climate Change, there are so many different options. The nice thing is that if people are interested in getting a tree for fall color, well, there's always the ginkgo. The ginkgo gets fantastic yellow fall color. Actually, something else to highlight about ginkgos is that they tend to, in the Pacific Northwest, around Halloween, drop their leaves pretty much over the course of a week. So they're even arguably one of the lowest maintenance tree options that we offer. To be transparent, some of the challenges of these super durable trees, the Oregon white oak being a good example, is that they can be trickier to transplant. Sometimes we have to try a couple times, and we always guarantee good stock. So if by chance, an Oregon white oak planted by Friends of Trees fails, before the growing season gets going, we will replace it for free. The reason that we're, and in fact, I believe last year the most commonly planted tree that we worked with was the Oregon white oak. Last year we had very, very good survival of our Oregon white oaks relative to some years prior to that. But again, they can be tricky. My hypothesis is that it's because they do have a more kind of a persistent taproot. And when they're grown in a field, it's kind of like cutting, the jugular vein. If you can re-establish that, you're good to go, but that can be a little tricky. So anyway, some of those most durable options, might take a steadier hand when planting, but again, that's short-term care for long-term benefit. Yeah. And if, again, I just want to introduce myself. I'm Andrew. Welcome to those of you who are watching. Feel free to share any questions, and we'd be happy to keep up with you. I can highlight in the meantime another interesting kind of human and tree symbiosis is with the Dawn Redwood. And again, the Dawn Redwood is actually the state fossil of Oregon. We know that they were here, and we also know that they disappeared for millions of years. Again, we know that in around, I believe it was just after the unfortunate bombing at Hiroshima, that they were rediscovered again in China. And there was a botanist who discovered this stand of trees, said, wait a minute, this looks like a tree that I have only seen in fossil form. He did his research and determined, wait a minute, this is the third redwood. There's the coast redwood, the giant sequoia, and the Dawn redwood. And the Dawn redwood is a deciduous conifer. So for those of you who aren't familiar with what that means, it means that they look like, in the fall, that they look like they're dying. They get rust fall color, and their needles actually fall off for the winter. But then they resprout with a really beautiful light green needle in the spring. And they are another great option in many, many ways. In the 1950s, I believe it was, after that scientist had rediscovered the Dawn redwood, the propagated plants were sent to arboretums around the world, one of which was Hoyt Arboretum here in Portland. And actually, I believe it was about 15 or 20 years ago, the first time that a Dawn redwood reproduced itself in Oregon, or excuse me, in North America for 5 million years, was here in Portland, Oregon at the Hoyt Arboretum. So for those of you who haven't been to Hoyt yet, that's a fabulous place to visit, and there is a truly remarkable specific tree in there, that Dawn redwood, that I would recommend you check out. A nice thing on the note of trees for climate change, those trees that grow rapidly and are durable, so things like a giant sequoia, a Douglas fir, the advantage to those is that they sequester carbon relatively quickly. You know, they're by virtue of growing and taking carbon out of the atmosphere to build themselves. So they're another great way that folks can, many people, for example, are very interested in planting natives. Natives are dynamite. The public right-of-way in front of many houses is not enough space to plant, a tree that will be 4 or 5 feet diameter someday. So they're an excellent option for folks who are interested in planting a yard tree. If you have the space in front of your house, by all means, an Oregon white oak, a Douglas fir would be a fantastic option. And again, in both cases, they do an excellent job of surviving and of helping to take that carbon out of the atmosphere. Another thing to consider about trees for climate change is that we know that we are very focused at Friends of Trees on issues of environmental justice. A couple weeks ago, I attended a webinar that was very, very insightful, and Dr. Vivek Chandas from PSU and Dr. Jeremy Hoffman, I believe this was with I think it was VCU, Virginia Commonwealth University, or University of Richmond. I'm sorry, I don't know exactly which school, but he's based in Richmond, Virginia. But anyway, they did some work where they compared maps of neighborhoods in American cities that had been redlined with maps of cities nowadays who are struggling with heat zones. And they determined that there's a very direct correlation between environmental injustice in redlined communities and the impact that still has today. Again, where there is extreme heat, there is far more vulnerability to public health problems in extreme heat episodes throughout the summer. And again, those are showing up in neighborhoods that were redlined, and to this day, many of which remain low canopy, low income, and often communities of color. We know that those neighborhoods are most heavily impacted by climate change. And the more we can encourage people to plant durable trees, to protect those trees, to do the basic maintenance. And again, Friends of Trees is very happy to help educate people through the stewardship process, through the establishment phase rather. And thankfully, nowadays, we also have, again, our pruning program, which allows a free structural and clearance pruning early in the tree's life. The idea being preventing problems down the road. So one of the things we say in our pruning program is, a 5-cent cut today prevents a $1,000 cut in 50 years. So we're really trying to do everything in our power to break down the barriers between, people having an active interest in trees and having a fear of trees. We say, listen, there's too much good that they are doing to focus only on the challenges. and in fact, the good greatly outweighs the bad. So again, we just want to encourage folks, when you're at the point of ordering a tree, just take an extra second to think, is this tree the most durable option that I am interested in? And if not, you should always feel free to check in with Friends of Trees staff. We're happy to share what we know. And again, there are a variety of trees for everyone's interests and for everyone's needs. You always want to match, for example, the tree to the culture of the space. In other words, I mentioned earlier that the Oregon white oak disappeared in the shade of Douglas firs. Even though I'm going on about the importance of the Oregon white oak, if you have a shaded space, they won't do well in that space. So it's always important to step one, observe the space that you're hoping to plant. What is the culture of that space? Is it hot and dry? Is it shady? Does it get morning sun, afternoon sun? Is it moist? Is it damp? Is it bone dry? Is it really compacted? Is it so anyway, just kind of gathering as much information as you can about the place you want to plant a tree. And with that in mind, compare that with your tree options and say, which of these tree options is going to fit my space best? Just doing that right there, you'll set yourself up you set your tree up for success, which means, the longest life. And again, the longer that a tree lives, its public health benefits expand exponentially as that tree gets bigger. You can consider, for example, one of the fantastic things about trees is that they are air and water filters. So we have learned through recent research, thankfully, that it's those trees that have, for example, the most surface area on their leaves. Think of, for example, a broom that you'd use to sweep the floor. The reason that's effective is because those long, skinny tines are almost exclusively surface area. And that dust sticks to anywhere on the surface, but there's a lot of surface area. If you think of a Douglas fir, or if you think of a ponderosa pine, you start to realize, hey, wait a minute, those are exactly like a broom, So they pick up, even though these particulates from pollution, traffic pollution, are in the air and we can't see them, they're still there. If we are under the canopy of a healthy tree that has either those needles that I'm talking about, also trees that have, leaves that are very tiny, are supposed to be, again, because there's more surface area, they're very effective air filters. Trees that have what are called tomentose leaves. Tomentose leaves have they're almost like they're little hairy leaves. And again, that also will help a tree to collect and filter out those particulates in the air. The reason that's really important, and what we've started to understand much better in recent years, is that there are very direct public health benefits associated with a good tree canopy in a neighborhood. In fact, I believe that, unfortunately, as a result of the Dutch elm problems in the mid 20th century, that they had the opportunity to say, hey, this community was healthy, low rates of asthma, no real cardiac problem, nothing unusual in terms of cardiac problems, average to healthy birth weights. And within 2 or 3 years after losing a huge amount of the canopy to pests, to this Dutch elm beetle, that suddenly asthma rates spiked and respiratory problems presented themselves, and also that birth weights were lower, which directly correlates to life expectancy. So again, nowadays we see that those trees that are susceptible to pests and to drought, those are not the trees that are going to be sticking around and protecting us and providing these public health benefits in 20 or 30 years if they're not planted in the right place, if they're not maintained, and if they're not protected. Again, the human and tree relationship is extremely symbiotic, but we all have to have an active role in stewarding our trees and protecting our trees and thinking about trees when we're voting and spending, in so many ways, in so many aspects of our lives. Yeah.
Amazing. Well, thank you so much, Andrew. That was an incredible talk. I know I learned so much. And thank you all for your comments, for tuning in, and for celebrating Earth Day with us in this way. You know, we wish that we were having these conversations in person. We wish you were shaking your hand. We wish we were giving you hugs. But and hopefully we could do that soon. But for the time being, it's so good connecting with you virtually and celebrating this really important day, the 51st Earth Day. And so thank you so much for joining. And speaking of Dr. Vivek Shandes, he's actually going to be live with our Deputy Director, Whitney Dorr, at 3 p.m. today, you know, speaking about like equitably planting trees and you know, heat island effect and you know, urban heat. So tune in. It's going to be a really good lecture. He is incredible if you haven't heard him speak. But I have a feeling that you all have. So hopefully you know, that it'll be great. But anyways, thank you so much for joining, for tuning in. Again, happy Earth Day, happy Earth Month. We look forward to Arbor Day. It's a month full of holidays, and if you're looking to get involved in a way, you know, beyond watching these videos, of course we love having you here. Please watch these videos, and don't feel like you need to. But if you're interested, we are you know, raising funds on Earth Day. We have $9,000 to go towards our $25,000 match, so your donations will be doubled, and you can visit our donation page following the link in this post. So thank you for considering, thank you for your support, thanks for being you, and we'll see you you know, so many more times today. We're going to be bringing live video really until 5 p.m. Tonight, and we're going to cap it all with a live pine cone crafting event at our Deputy Director Whitney Dorr's house. So that's going to be super fun and great. So thank you, Andrew. Thank you all for tuning in, and we'll see you soon.
Happy Earth Day.
Happy Earth Day.